calling from the UK, so good afternoon, everybody. As we've said, my superpowers are dyslexia and ADHD, and having worked in the field of neurodiversity for quite a number of years, I'm still absolutely overjoyed that none of us can actually pronounce half of the conditions that fall within that remit, myself included. I wanted to, I'm obviously coming at this from a slightly different perspective to some of the other teachers, in that I have spent most of my life working in education. But I also now run an education technology company, and part of the reason for me working in tech was that I recognized that there are a range of solutions that are available that can reduce some of the impacts that the education system often has on people that think differently. So I feel personally that I'm very honoured to be here, because I feel that I sit on the bridge between tech and education. There have been a couple of really fantastic questions in the hallway already, and I do encourage people to engage with this. And one of the things that's coming through very strongly is not only our own experiences and how we deal with that, but how we actually work as our families, how we support our children through this system. I mean, in fact, I went on the journey that I've been on. I was diagnosed quite a long time. I know it's hard to believe that I'm over 30, but I was diagnosed in the late 1970s with dyslexia, which was a relatively early diagnosis in terms of the history of identification, particularly in the United Kingdom. I was 15 at the time. And like many, I'd gone through school with a rather unique experience, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But I spent quite a lot of time in denial, because I felt I didn't fit of what has turned out to be the way of thinking that has made me who I am today. It wasn't until I went into teaching, and I sort of wandered around muddy fields for a while and did a few other things. An ecologist, actually. So before we had cybersecurity, when we were counting things and using Minitab and things like that, how much other learners, the young people I was working with, were in the staff room getting the same I was hearing the same conversations about those learners as I think happened about myself, and I realised I had to change something. So this is a bit of a personal story. I'm also going to spend some time, because maths learning difficulties is my specialism, dyscalculia, and we don't talk about it very much. And it's a hugely unidentified condition. So I want to spend 5 minutes talking about that as well, because I think some of you may find it useful, and on that allyship that we all share with people with neurodiversity, it will be helpful. I've had two conversations in the last 24 hours that have really resonated with me in terms of what we're talking with. The first was with my commercial director just before lunch, when we were discussing the power of allyship. And it's been really valuable for me recently to find myself working with other neurodiverse people and sitting on panels with neurodiverse people, and just feeling that I really belong with a group of people who I admire greatly and I really enjoy working with. And we are all different, as I want to explain in a minute. You know, one of I think the most important things that we learn about if we're engaging with neurodiverse people, and as we grow to understand ourselves, is that everybody within our community is diverse, as is the whole community. And within that, there's, you know, it doesn't matter whether I've got ADD and dyslexia and I'm talking to somebody with autism, you know, there is a really strong allyship. in spite of the fact that I am going to show you lots and lots of PowerPoints, and my reaction to doing a 45-minute talk is 45 minutes. How much information can I absolutely cram into that and run through? And so I recognise that might not be a delivery style that works for everybody. So apologies if I'm going at 110 miles an hour. The second conversation was with somebody who's arrived with us last week on an internship. And we were just chatting, and I was mentioning that I was doing this talk, and she just sort of said, well, I've always had struggles at school. And we had a bit of a sort of conversation about what those manifested like. And I said, look, I've got, because of the assessment work I do, I've got a paper-based tool that we can use to just look at ADHD and a couple of other conditions, and we'll just go through it. And we sat down together and did our ADHD sort of paper-based screening tool together and compared notes on the similarities and differences and the rich discussion that allowed us to have. And one of the things that I think has come through from both Nicola and the panel's discussion is this thing about creating a space in work and in school where we are able to have those discussions. And that's very much part of what I want to talk about. So as I've said already, I mean, everybody is neurodiverse in some ways. As Sun Tzu, if you're a gamer, it's worth keeping up with the Art of War every now and again just to get your gaming strategies really sorted. And what I really like about it is it's very data driven. But if we think of how we categorize people in terms of their cognition or their communication or their emotional intelligence, their general intelligence, we're putting people into sort of very primary groupings. But of course, people are different to that. We don't fit neatly into these very narrow groupings. And when we start exploring what neurodiversity might manifest itself at, if we look at a normal, of course, because I come from the UK, everything has to have a Harry Potter analogy. I'm a very neurodiverse, positive employer. In fact, I'll probably say that I do occasionally give neurotypical people a chance. That would probably be the fairest way of doing it. So I refer to every neurotypical person as a muggle, and we obviously are the wizards, although my chief technical officer, who claims that he is neurotypical, says that he wants to know there is magic in everyone. What we tend to find is that, the things that we measure in somebody that we might consider, and this is stereotyping beyond on reasonable levels, that, those measures are very much sort of centered around the center of the normal distribution curve within one standard deviation of it. I'm talking maths already, I know, I'm really sorry about that, I can't help myself. Whereas if we look at the profile of a neurodiverse person, all that happens is that some of those things are more spread out. And in fact, in many cases with people that are neurodiverse, there are certain qualities that are particularly strong. And one of the questions that I'm often asked is about, how do we deal with the trauma that education does inflict on us? And obviously that's something I want to talk about a little bit more. And one thing that really comes through very strongly is I think one of the reasons that neurodiverse people can be very, very successful is that the school system does perversely create an awful lot of resilience in us. And that's a good thing. That's something that we need and we should challenge and we should build in our children. And conversations we have with our children who maybe are struggling at school is, well, about resilience and how that builds. But also that we see that we have skills that aren't always measured in the education system, like problem solving. And yet when we're measured on literacy or numeracy skills, we perhaps find it difficult to communicate those things. And all neurodiversities are about the ability to handle information and then communicate that information. It's about how the brain processes information at the end of the day. There's an excellent blog, and the nature of my brain is I can't actually, of course, now remember the name of the person. But the link is there in the slides, and I'm very happy for my slides to be openly available, called Leading from the Back of the Class. And I think it really sums up how school, education, college often impacts on people with neurodiversity. It can feel like we are constrained by such a narrow set of rules. And some of the brains that, us here, we have done so many things that we talked about in terms of, Nicola was talking about thinking outside of the box, and how if you can think at the edge of the box, that's what the system, the man seems to want. But we want to push the box. In fact, we want to tear down the sides of the box and turn it into a sports car. So we have these very restrictive processes, but actually we're still at the place, and I think this is something that we collectively have to empower ourselves to do. We're still at the place that we don't have an active voice at the table. And I think a lot of that active voice is because people still are not able to own themselves. We've seen in the UK quite recently a number of politicians have come out and said they're dyslexic. This is really positive. So we're starting to get people being more open about it. And the tech and cybersecurity have always been very open about it, because these are the kind of jobs that we migrate towards, because these accentuate our skill sets. But we still allow that vast majority of people to set the assessment process. So we're working in an environment where we are being measured by people. We're not being measured by ourselves. We're being measured by another set of measures. So this is the personal overshare. That's one of the joys of ADD, is the ability to overshare and just say, it's not my fault, it's just the way my brain works. This was from about 1976, a school report, and I'm sure it's familiar, however old you are. So even if you've only recently left school, I'm sure for some of you this will sound very familiar. I was not making sufficient effort. All my mistakes were silly. And I have this rule, whenever I hear another educator use the word silly mistake, I refer back to, it takes me back to this in sort of report in 1976, and I'm back as that unhappy child, that traumatized child. And so it's my job to eradicate the word silly from education. And actually, when you explain it to teachers, they do. Now, of course, all the silly mistakes were down to my idleness. I am, I admit, bone idle. All I want to do is sit around and play cricket, because that's what English gentlemen do. And it's going to adversely affect my future. Well, I think the fact that we're here now, I hope proves that, if that was the future that I was destined to, I am very proud to be here now. I'm very proud to be talking to you all, and I nearly swore, but I do have a message for the teacher that wrote that. And so that these experiences, I think, are remarkably common, and this is what we're dealing with. And here's the key. This is what I have learned through my life. You are not broken. The education system may make you believe you are broken, but you are not. I want to just go off on a little tangent. Tangent, there's a maths word, and I'm going to talk about maths. I'm going to go off on a tangent and talk about maths learning difficulties, A, because I was asked to, and B, because I think it puts into place. Perhaps most of us, I'm going to make an assumption and stereotyping again, that's my bias. Most of us possibly found maths being one of the places where we could find some comfort. But so it might be interesting to look at mathematics as case study in exclusion. And I totally accept that there will be people here who have had a very challenging relationship with mathematics. The way that our brain handles mathematics information or numerical information is very complex, and it's not for here today, but there are some, I do thoroughly recommend some exploring some of the things about neuroscience of cognition. We have to recognize the connection between number symbols and number words and the actual magnitudes, the cardinality of values, how big numbers are, and to be able to compare those numbers. We have to recognize that we have this sequential order of numbers, irrespective of what base system we're working in. We have this, so we have to transcode. We have the visual category of recognizing how we do things. So there's a lot of processing that happens when we're actually understanding, getting our head around numbers work. But the trouble is, where we've got with mathematics is that we've got into a bit of, particularly in the English-speaking world and Western Europe, we've got ourselves into a bit of an awkward place, really. The way that mathematics is taught in schools, which is largely to end up with a qualification at the end of it, we're on a little factory conveyor belt in which we've been moved along. It's not about actually developing knowledge and skills, it's about passing those gatekeeper qualifications. Is that we start to think that mathematics has to be something that's done quickly and has to be done in your head. So firstly, we've got this cognition thing about actually understanding how number works. And secondly, then we have these cultural habits that which have some value and some use, but so, you know, they don't respect the difference in thinking that people have around mental arithmetic, about fact recall. And it becomes really difficult then. You automatically then start to exclude people from the system. So for example, if you're doing a multiplication tables test, a times test, which children in the UK have to do aged 7, they have to do this sort of repetitive times tables test at speed. That's actually also testing your fact retrieval, your working memory skills. So it's measuring your executive functioning efficiency, probably more so than your arithmetical efficiency. Now, I'm not saying that not knowing your multiplication tables, you know, or knowing your multiplication tables isn't helpful, but it's not everything. So this doing things quickly, doing things in your head, which challenges people in a range of ways, often leads to low confidence amongst a much broader group of people than the 5 to 7% that we would consider to have a maths learning difficulty dyscalculia. In fact, around 45% of adults say they have some level of discomfort with mathematics, some level of mathematics anxiety. And the figure that we use in the United Kingdom for low attainment in mathematics accounts for around 33% of the population. In fact, 1/4, 25% of the population in the UK, and it's not very much different in North America, and it's not hugely different in Europe as well, are functionally innumerate. They don't have the level of numeracy to engage with the mathematics that they encounter in their everyday life. So this creates all sorts of problems with fixed mindsets. There's no point in teaching mathematics to me. I'm rubbish at it. I'm always going to be rubbish at it. Never get on. It starts to build problems with lack of resilience, in that, you know, there's no point in me putting any effort in because there's no return on my investment. All the effort I put in just tells me that I'm failing, impacting on confidence and anxiety. And a huge percentage of the population have significant difficulties with that. Mathematics is wrapped up with literacy and communication skills, and the neurodiversities that those can present. I mean, mathematics is a language in its own right, and the ability to communicate in mathematics is something that, and we've seen this during the pandemic, is something that, you know, when we've noticed the data literacy of the wider population, is something of fairly significant concern, the poor data literacy. Reasoning and problem solving, and again, particularly in the UK, and I mean, I'm not saying that we're worse than anywhere else. We're a fairly average nation in terms of where we sit within international scales. That we don't teach reasoning and problem solving particularly well. Then we start getting into the neurodiverse memory and speed of processing, number sense, this condition dyscalculia, and this condition dyscalculia, which I'm just going to run through a definition shortly, it specifically impacts arithmetic, and it's to do with how we perceive number. It's to do with our sense of number. And then we have the impacts of other SPLDs. For me, as a dyslexic learning my times tables, I am slow, clunky at retaining facts. It takes me a long time to learn things off by heart, and I would still argue that for many multiplication facts, I don't know them automatically. I still have to calculate them. That's actually made me quite an efficient arithmetician, in that I've become very good at decomposing and recomposing numbers. Something I know that in the United States they actively teach in schools now, that flexibility with numbers. But it doesn't mean that I'm very, very good, very efficient at regurgitating times tables. So it had an impact, and for a long time during my schooling, I felt I wasn't very good at maths because I was slower than everybody else. And I thought that speed was king. For those of you who love a good visual, this is the actual neuroscience of mathematics learning difficulties. So we have this how we actually represent numerosities in our brain, the size of things, and if I was talking for longer specifically about dyscalculia, I'd show you lots of pictures of wildebeest and lions and chickens to help do this. And that's the domain specific, and one of the things I think around all neurodiversities is we have these domain specific. So with dyslexia, for example, it's phonological processing. For dyspraxia, it's about fine motor coordination. With dyscalculia, it's about this representation of numerosity. And then we have these domain general skills. And in fact, it's these domain general skills that often present the biggest challenge in education. So our working memory, our ability to maintain focus, our ability to shift from hyper-focus, all of those kinds of things have an impact. And then outside of that, of course, we have the impact of the environment, the home, the quality of teaching, which socioeconomic status all have an impact. This really is a rattle through because that's the way I go. A couple of 3 years ago, we wrote a definition for dyscalculia in the UK, which is designed to be forward facing. It's designed to be for teachers, assessors, educational psychologists to work with. So dyscalculia is a specific and persistent difficulty in understanding numbers. So when we say it's a mathematical learning difficulty, it's about how your ability to do, or your efficiency doing mathematics, rather than your efficiency learning mathematics. And I think that's an important distinction. And it's around difficulties with this sense of number, and we measure it by doing symbolic and non-symbolic magnitude comparison tasks. There's a very good lab at the University of Western Ontario run by a guy called Daniel Ansari, and they do have a screening tool that's available online. which if you want to understand more about these words, we can do. And if you join me in the hallway after, I can direct you if this is something that resonates with you. Anyway, we were talking about trauma, weren't we? Oh, main impacts of dyscalculia. So obviously, a difficulty understanding number creates huge problems learning mathematics. People with dyscalculia tend to be very process-driven rather than understanding what happens with the number. Interestingly, people with dyslexia quite often are very concept-driven and have to use the concepts to track back to the process. There are difficulties understanding written numbers, particularly translating through place value. Difficulties knowing whether your answer is correct, and difficulties with estimating. So just literally knowing whether 17 times 13, whether 30 is a reasonable answer to that. How it manifests itself in later life, problems with using money, particularly with using notes and coins. Interestingly, increasingly, as we've started using cards and tap and go, that when people were using coins left, that actually helped dyscalculics to some extent. But in the UK, we've now raised the limit on cards from £25, which are around $30, to £100, which would be $110, $115. And so obviously that's a much larger amount to work with. So it becomes more complicated for people. So in terms of the trauma that we experience in school, I remember it really resonated with me that I was working with some students in a college in London, and or I was observing a lesson. And one guy was asked to do something that he was really uncomfortable with, and he came up with the immortal, now in my mind, I can't do that, it will shame me. And I think it was the use of that word shame that really resonated with me. And I think it's worth just reflecting on actually the emotional response that creates the trauma. And I'm sure to some extent all of us would recognize at different times the fear, the frustration, the awkwardness that we felt, and how that meant we then communicated. And when you're feeling awkward and fearful and confused, and a teacher says, okay, Pete, what's the answer to this? Your awkwardness and your confusion and your fear make it much harder to answer, and therefore the implications of what's happening. The withdrawal, therefore, that feeling of difference. And I felt different, and I still do feel different, but I can now come and talk to you guys, and that makes me feel the same with the 510 of you. Wonderful. It makes me feel, you know, that I'm talking to my people. And I think we also then start to get into these alternative belongings, the fact that we don't fit into school and trying to find out where we do fit in. And sometimes that manifests itself, particularly when you're going through adolescence, where belonging and avoidance of shame are the overriding emotions. That starts to lead then into what might be considered challenging to the norm. And I think when we talk about challenging behavior, we always have to think about who is being challenged by that. And I mean, I'm not saying that, you know, all behaviors are acceptable, but all behaviors are a form of communication. So it's very easy to see within an education system that requires a lot of conformity, an over-reliance on the regurgitation of process, fitting to a timescale. So you know, this time bound, you've got to achieve this rather than in this set of times, rather than you have to understand this. Doing what you're told to do. I'm going to show you how to do it and just replicate it. that very binary decision making. And what I've talked about, I hope, all the way through this is that the world is essentially fuzzy. And one of the failings of the system, of any system, is when we try and reduce that fuzziness down to a small number of boxes. And this over-reliance, so in the UK, we call them the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. That works for a dyslexic person. That's absolutely wonderful. There's no logic leap in calling reading, writing, and arithmetic the 3 R's for a dyslexic person. That's absolutely fine. Just don't expect me to do anything than start every one of those words with the letter R for the rest of my life. So I think that's systematic of how there is slight miscommunication within the system. If we take that to the workplace, into a good workplace, and I know we've had many discussions so far about how workplaces can be as challenging. You know, for everything I'm talking about, the education system, for many people that replicates itself in the workplace. But when we think about the skills that we actually need, and particularly what we need for what we're here to talk about today in terms of sort of tech-based jobs, we need to be able to solution. We need to be able to recognize what the problem is and work from the problem through to a solution. That might mean that we have to think outside the box. That might mean that we just go back and do something that we don't do often enough, which is find out what the problem is in the first place. We need to observe. We need to have skills of observation. That can be fine detail, that can be overarching observation, it can be conceptual, it can be minute. A level of creativity. And I don't mean necessarily the ability to paint, because I'm absolute rubbish at painting, and I'm even worse at the guitar, even though me and Eric Clapton were, you know, brothers from another mother. An eye for detail, the ability to innovate, and the ability to communicate. And communication, again, doesn't have to be in a single form. It doesn't have to be written communication or verbal communication. I like my engineers to comment really well on their code. We don't have many social interactions with them, but they write good comment on their code, and that is absolutely effective communication for what I need them to be able to do, because that's how we run our organization. So it's also within each of these things, being able to see the fuzziness and the adaptability and the agility to recognize that what is effective in a certain situation is what is useful. So what does if we're going to disrupt the education system, what will we need to do? Well, it's quite simple. The effective use of data, and I don't know what it's like in the rest of the world, but we collect lots of data in the UK in the education system, and it's rubbish. We don't know what to do with it. We just collect it because it meets some KPIs, not because it informs anything. We want to use data to understand how that person thinks. And once we've understood how that person thinks, we can use that data to inform how to learn. So it's starting to sound like a tech project, isn't it? We need to have empathy. We need to manage emotions. Now, this is where the tech bit starts to get a bit tricky. But actually, if you provide the data for the teacher can do what a teacher should do best, which is manage emotions, is engage people with learning, is motivate them in the knowledge that they are providing the best education for that person. And most of all, and I think this is really important for us in terms of allyship, trust. It doesn't matter whether it's the workplace or education, there must be trust. And that trust must be that all of those above are used wisely, that the data we collect is used wisely to inform learning, the learning is used wisely, and we manage emotions wisely. So that's okay then, isn't it? You know, we work in tech, and actually we've got all the skills that we need to work in tech. So we're brilliant. We're absolutely bloody brilliant. So there shouldn't be any more change. So how have we achieved that? Well, here's my short tips, because I think it's really important. Everybody's different. So what I say works for me isn't necessarily going to work for everybody else. We have to adjust those schemas that develop the trauma, and the schemas were developed because a small band of knowledge and skills measured in a way that does not suit many people who think differently. Back to that normal distribution curve. But the world of work is changing, and we have much to offer, and we belong. We are, by definition, because it's been so shit up until now, resilient. And that's very, very powerful. That is something that we can offer to our children, to our colleagues, something we can model. And I think listening to Nicola, and who spoke like a business coach I could really engage with, you know, those abilities to sort of understand ourselves and to be resilient around that are something that we can be teaching many people who find education easier. In fact, there's some really interesting research came out of Stanford by Joe Bowler that suggests that those people who found education very easily and then hit a ceiling, sort of grade 11, grade 12, that kind of thing, fall back in terms of their confidence and self-efficacy much further than those that have had to work hard. And finally, use the skills that we have, whether that's an analysis of granular data or whether that's our ability to conceptualize or our ability to empathize, to know ourselves. And it might be awkward, but it helps us to answer one question. And I think the whole, whether it's in education or the workplace, the biggest question that we, I think, don't know, or we find it hard to say, but other people do, is what support do I need to excel? We all need a level of support. I've nearly finished, Steph. I can see you there. So for me, I mean, people ask me what support. Do you know what? Kanban works really well for me because I like the physical process of moving of things around. Agile and Scrum, that suits me down to the ground. It doesn't suit everybody. It's absolutely fantastic. I know what I have to do in a short space of time. That really manages it. I can focus on that. I can crack on. It helps me. I also have somebody that supports me. I've promoted myself to a level of complete irresponsibility now, and I have somebody who works alongside me. And I think the other thing which came through really strongly this morning, it is the morning for you, isn't it? An understanding and empathetic boss. Now, it turns out actually for me, the best boss I could actually have is me. I am an awesome boss because I'm not broken. But there are other people out there, and I know it's not easy to find those, but we are all here together advocating. And I think that's really important. In terms of ways to go forward, Brené Brown, Martin Seligman, Carol Dweck are all people that you can engage with and I think take a lot of comfort from. So you're not broken. And the key is us together working as one to raise our voices and be heard with those difficult employers. And together, throughout the structure of tech cybersecurity, from the top to the bottom, we have CEOs who are neurodiverse, and we have people coming in as interns who are together. We are allies and we need to work with each other. Thank you.